Let's see here. Stream starting. We are live. All right. Hello, everyone. What's going on? Welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I'm going to be sitting down and talking with Pastor Joon Park. He is a hospital chaplain, a sixth degree black belt, a former atheist turned skeptical Christian, a recovered porn addict, and a suicide survivor. But why I want to have him here and why I'm so stoked about this conversation is because specifically today we're going to be focusing in on Pastor Joon's faith journey. I first discovered Pastor Joon a number of months ago on Twitter when a friend of mine actually reposted a handful of his tweets, and like the text literally just jumped off of the phone, grabbed my attention so strongly, and this is what I want to talk to you guys about today. As many of you guys know, for context, we've been going through a series on this channel and John's channel, Letters to the Church, Francis Chan. Many of you guys know that for the last couple of years, I have been wrestling personally with the church. I know that the church is an important thing. God says that this is a valuable thing. And yet when I go to church, when I experience church community as it is most often found, I leave that place feeling frustrated and confused. Frustrated because this clearly is not what God has talked about, what God has desired, and confused because really, why is the church so important? Why can't I just stay at home, worship on my own, seek to be the good in the world that's out there? But why specifically the church? And I think a lot of you guys are there. I think a lot of you guys are struggling with this. I've talked to a lot of you guys. The latest studies say 59% of millennials, that's people in my age demographic, end up leaving the church. But most of them who are surveyed, they aren't leaving the faith or leaving God. In fact, many of them would articulate that they're leaving the church in an attempt to find God and to salvage their faith. And so when I came across these tweets, I'm going to read to you guys these in a second. I think that this will really blow your mind. This is why I want to have this conversation, because I think that there's so many of you guys out there that are where I'm at as far as your relationship to the church. You want something deeper. You want something more. I think that our generation, more than any other, is not okay with just the surface level thing. The thing that I just show up to on the weekend, I sing a couple songs, I pay my tithe, I listen to the pastor, and I leave not really changed, not really empowered or challenged to go out and do something. And so I really am stoked to kind of dive into this conversation. Joon and I have been talking now for about 15 minutes. Most of that has been trying to figure out whether the webcam is working, the audio is working. So do us a favor, let us know if everything's working out once we get him on the screen. Of course, if you're watching this live, do me a favor and give this video a thumbs up and share this video right now, because someone might actually be blessed by this conversation. With that said, let's go ahead and look at the 3 tweets that I wanted to share with you guys that stood out to me. You can follow Joon Park at JSParkBlog, and this is the tweet that he said. He said, "So after 3 years, I'm leaving my evangelical church. It's a painful decision that my wife and I made with tons of grief. We knew many wonderful people who did good things, but I can't support some of these things I've seen and heard any longer. I'm lost and sad and tired." I know that I've been there before. He goes on to say, "I grew up as an atheist. I became a Christian later in life. I went to this evangelical church, an outsider, both spiritually and racially, excited by grace and by the community, but yet reading the Bible and seeing the church were worlds apart. And 2 years ago, the dissonance became unbearable." He says, "I'm not done with the evangelical church yet, but I have no idea where to go. My wife and I haven't been to church in a few months, and I don't know of any church nearby who both loves Jesus and is socially generous, who sees me fully both a child of Christ and a son to immigrants." So I don't know what in those tweets you relate to, but I think there's something for everybody. And so I'm super stoked to have Joon here on the channel. Joon, thank you so much for taking the time and being so open with your journey on Twitter and your other social media platforms, but also being willing to come and talk with me live on the channel.
Yeah, Justin, thank you for having me on. And I have to say, in the short time that I've known you and seen your stuff, I am a fan of your stuff.
Thank you. I'll pay you later.
You're the real deal. I love the questions that you bring up, the things that you talk about with faith, not afraid to get authentic. I love it. So I am so honored and glad to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. Catch us up on your story. There's a lot in your bio. 6th degree black belt, former atheist. If you can, share us kind of where you've been in the past, where God has led you, maybe prior to these tweets going public and kind of publicly wrestling with this journey.
Yeah, I can take it back all the way to, let's see, when I was born. No. I grew up an atheist. My dad was identified as a Christian, but it was one of those things where I wasn't sure if he was or not just by the way that he lived. And then my grandmother was a Shintoist.
Oh,
And
okay. Not too many people will know what Shintoism is.
yeah, she did the kind of chanting by incense to the ancestors. She was part of a small sect of Shintoism.
Okay.
So I kind of sometimes catch her in the garage with the fumes going off from the incense and with the beads and praying and all that. And then my mom, I would say, was an atheist. And after seeing my dad and my grandma, I chose atheism. And I must have been an atheist until at least, I want to say, my early 20s.
Okay.
And then even then, when things started changing for me, when I started discovering God and or he was discovering me, it was not an overnight epiphany. It
Of
was just one
course.
of those, yeah, slow burns into kind of asking questions about my questions, that kind of things, doubting my doubts.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And even when I guess you could say, quote unquote, converted or transformed or identified as a Christian, became a believer in the Christian story, still there's skepticism there.
Mm-hmm.
Still, there was a lot of, even in the tweet I alluded to it or outright just said it, where I would read the Bible and then I would see the way that the church was. And of course, there's no perfect church, no perfect community in general,
Mm-hmm.
but I would see such a wide disparity. And so I think the journey up to now it's always been a struggle. It hasn't always been an easy thing of just finding the right community, seeing people live out authentically. And I know that I'm trying to hold space for people authentically trying to find community because it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Same time, this other extreme of like weaponizing scripture and taking that and turning it into something it was never meant to.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
We're going to dive into kind of what that was specifically for you. I have an idea. You alluded to it as the son of immigrants and things along those lines. But one thing that stood out to me by your profile and your website and all these different kinds of things is that you branded yourself as a skeptical Christian. I'd love for you to divulge on that a little bit because in this community on the That Christian Vlogger channel, a lot of people always ask the question in regards to, is it wrong to have doubts? Is it wrong to have questions? Is faith supposed to be blind? Like how do you interpret that whole train of thought? How do you wrestle and define yourself as a skeptical Christian?
Yeah, I think that comes in several different layers. And I guess to make the long story, the big picture into kind of a focused one, I think for one, the way that I came into faith, I came from thinking the Christian story was just this untenable, unsustainable kind of Swiss cheese type of story.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started to believe the Christian story, I took, quote unquote, the leap of faith while still holding those questions,
Oh, okay.
So when you go to the church and you do your profession of faith in whatever faith community you might be a part of, you kind of have to do a checklist of these are the doctrines that I believe, and then some people do the Apostles' Creed at the start of a service.
Sure.
So I loved the Christian story. I loved the idea and concept and teaching of Jesus. I was all on board for the resurrection and all that stuff, restoration from death to life, all of that.
For sure.
But there was so much still about it, I think, at the doctrinal level that I just found unbelievable. And I remember holding those questions and thinking, do people really believe this stuff, or are they just saying it, because they want to look like they're part of a community? Are we just believing this so we can do the social thing? So I don't, so there were those questions.
Uh-huh.
Doctrinally, historically, does that make sense?
I find that so interesting that the thing that jumped out to you was the communal component of church. And yet, fast forwarded, how many years have you been a Christian now?
Oh my gosh. I want to say still a baby Christian, maybe. Yeah, it's such a strange journey. 8, 10
Okay.
maybe.
Okay,
Yeah.
8-10 years, somewhere around that. And while community was the driving point to bring you kind of, at least open-mindedly to this kind of discussion, it seems like community has also been the way that you've been. I don't want to say this because it seems how do I rephrase this? I want to say that it's the community that has kind of been the biggest hang-up as well for your faith journey. Is that accurate?
Yeah, probably like a double-edged sword. I've told this story before, but I think when I started going to the faith community that I was originally a part of, I would see people who just acted with supernatural generosity and patience. Not that they were perfect, but they were passionate for Christ. They were passionate for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, there's something impossible happening here. It's not how people act. And I thought, well, maybe they just grew up sheltered and they had nice lives. But as I talked to each person, some of them had these traumatic lives and just They had no reason to be the way that they were, at least in my viewpoint, my opinion. But as I started to talk to each person, I was like, something happened to them, something supernatural, not natural, not in the flesh, not anything that I could explain. And so the community helped for me to extrapolate, I think, backwards. Or what was the truth that they encountered that sparked within them this divine sort of love and grace that they seemed to manifest. And so that for me, the community was a part of me being drawn to Christ. And at the same time, as I got deeper into that community, and more recently so, there are things where I felt like, wow, the disparity, though, between certain parts of the community and Christ are just too wide for me to bear.
Interesting. So has this kind of positive interaction with the church community led you down the path that you're currently down? And I speak specifically towards like the chaplaincy. You're talking about people who have gone through some immense pain and suffering, and yet doing so with such like grace and posture. What's the word I'm looking for? Is it posture? No, that's not the word. Who doing so in such a great way. Is that as kind of what led you kind of to seek out those people perhaps a little bit more and to share hope in that way? Or was that something that you already had planned beforehand?
That's a good question. Can you rephrase it or maybe say that question one more time?
Sure. You had experienced something supernatural in the way that certain people in the community experienced loss and grief and perhaps abuse, or whatever words you want to fill in the blank. I'm curious if that has kind of led to a certain mission in your life as a hospital chaplain, seeking those kinds of people out who perhaps don't have that faith background and trying to be helpful to them.
Yeah, I think so. And here's a rough thing about that. I think the deeper that I got into the faith community, and I thought I was called to hurting people like the homeless, like those in the hospital, those in prison. The faith communities that I've had experiences with, and this is kind of anecdotal and just in my experience, is that they didn't want to go to those places. And for whatever reasons. Maybe they thought they're homeless because it's their fault. They brought it on themselves. They didn't do their homework in high school. They're in prison because they made those choices. They're sick because they're cursed and they sinned and there's something wrong with them, and that sickness was something that they're being cursed with. So I don't know if that's a conscious level thought. That could be a kind of a subconscious theological sort of deeper thought. But I think when I got to these faith communities, there were people who wanted to do it, but it just felt like there was this inexorable pull into inertia, like, nope, we're just here for the body of believers. So on one hand, I want to say that, yes, the faith community drew me to that. But on the other hand, the faith community seemed to resist it so much. And so, yeah, it looks like your gears are turning.
It's interesting because that wasn't the answer I was expecting. I was expecting like, oh, yeah, absolutely. I was inspired by these people, so I wanted to go seek more people out like that, but it's clearly not. So then how did you end up in chaplaincy and pretty much ministering to those kinds of people all the time?
Yeah. So, I did pastoral ministry a total of 7 years. I was 5 years at one church and almost 2 years at another. And then at the first church that I was at 5 years, major problems. It was a very messy ending. The second church that I was at ended well. I think our relationships are still pretty solid. I still see the people there. But when I left, I felt called to leave. I felt like it wasn't my place to be within pastoral ministry anymore. When I moved on, I tried to work at I applied to all these different nonprofits. That's where I felt like I needed to work, homeless, prison ministry, all these different kinds of things. That's where I ended up at chaplaincy. And when I got into chaplaincy, it was like a calling that I didn't know existed and that I never knew I wanted until I got there. I think and this is not a unique story, or it doesn't make me like special or anything, but I don't think I fit into the current model of pastoral evangelical ministry.
Yeah.
Done. And there are people that are called to that. There are people that love doing it and are good at it. I just never felt like I fit that. And I'm sure a lot of people could say that, like, oh, I don't belong anywhere, that kind of thing. I really did not feel wired or gifted or called to it. And I could be the first to tell you, I had a lot of shortcomings in that ministry. When I got to chaplaincy, I feel like I really thrived, and this was the right seat on the bus.
That's awesome. That's super cool. One more story I wanted to kind of hear about before we dive into really the crux of this all and kind of the whole leaving church thing and this discussion, I read in a bio online. I know that you didn't ask me to say this, so this is not like you like pumping yourself up, but you mentioned in one of your articles giving away 50% of your income. And the reason why I want to hear about your chaplaincy journey and this story, because I think a lot of people, when they hear people leaving the church, they automatically assume that they're actually not committed to the gospel or truly in love with God, or any, like, they just assume that they're lesser than spiritually in some way, shape, or form. And I'm trying to help craft that this is not the case. Like, you've been wrestling through this for a while. You've given considerable parts of your life towards the gospel and building the kingdom, and you've even gone as far as what most people would never in their life do. And I'm assuming, I don't know the full story, but you wrote somewhere that you had given 50% of your income to some kind of nonprofit. Can you tell me that story?
Yeah, that was back in, I want to say it was 2012. And so I went on this sabbatical from ministry. That was the first one that I was at for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard this sermon by Eugene Cho he was a senior pastor of Quest Church out in Seattle, and he founded One Day's Wages, which is a nonprofit charity. They do lots of things, lots of incredible things. They help women out of human trafficking. They help build water wells and that kind of thing in other countries. They help the homeless as well. And when I heard this sermon by Pastor Eugene Cho, oh my gosh, I was just so convicted about the American values that I had bought into and kind of the wasteful way that I was living. And maybe that sounds generic or stereotypical, but I really was taken in by what he was saying. I was so convicted about faith and action being put together. And I remember I went to a buffet by myself that week. And I don't know, I have nothing against buffets or people who go there, but I saw families going in through the entrance and out through the exit. And I just thought, gosh, I've been a consumer for so long.
Hmm.
And again, nothing against buffets. I'm not trying to moralize or demonize that.
You can still go to Hometown Buffet after church if you want to. It's all right.
I came back from a sushi buffet.
Oh, so, even better.
Against them, but I think just that image conjured up in me, kind of like, am I stewarding wisely for the kingdom of God? Am I, is there sacrifice in my faith? Is it really being lived out? So I made a commitment for the next year to save half my salary, which wasn't much. I was making like $20,000 in a year as a youth pastor. And I saved $10K, and then I gave it to One Day's Wages, which was Eugene Cho's nonprofit charity. Like, we didn't plan it together or anything. I just kind of emailed him out of the blue, like halfway through the year, and said, hey, I'm going to save up half my salary and just write a check at the end of the year. And I gave it to their kind of department that fights human trafficking. And because I read through their whole website, and I was most moved by what they did for that, hiring lawyers to reintegrate women back into society who had been human trafficked. It was just a beautiful thing that they were doing. And, I just hearing his sermon, it was the first time I really felt like I was partnering with and participating in God's activity on earth.
Wow.
Your will on earth as it is in heaven. And it was a beautiful experience the whole way through. And it was funny. There were weird things, like one week I didn't have enough money for groceries.
Oh, wow.
And then, somebody gave me like $100 Publix gift card, like a grocery store gift card.
Nice.
Another time I was behind on bills, and some lady in the parking lot of the church hit my car and took off. And she found me that week and was like, hey, I'm the one who hit your car, and I'm going to write.
Wow.
And so she gave me more than enough money, not only to cover for the damages, but I put some of the money away in the money that I was saving, and I was able to pay my bills that month. And between you and me, I didn't end up fixing my car. I just I'd let the dent ride out.
I've actually done that as well.
Yeah. Miraculous stuff like that. When you take those kinds of risks, I'm not saying it always works out, but man, I saw God move in ways that, gosh, I would never have unless I had made that decision. It was just a beautiful thing. Loved it.
Awesome.
Loved every second of it.
That's awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. And that's incredible because, so much of church culture is consumerism. It's we sit in the church, we get fed our sermon, fed our music, and then we just go on our life as if nothing else had changed. And I really admire your desire to live out the message in a very real and authentic way. And I think that these stories kind of illustrate that, your calling presently, your decision with finances, things like that. And so, with that said, I'm really curious if we can shift our attention over towards those couple of tweets that you had put out a while back. You were seeing that there was a dissonance between the church and the Bible. What was that like?
Yeah, this is going to be, I feel like this is a super sensitive topic because I think different people believe different things about what the Bible says
Mm-hmm.
for social and political purposes. I think different people would have different thoughts on is the evangelical church involved enough? Are they involved too much in certain ways they shouldn't be? And so I say this with all sensitivity for people who might vote differently or think differently. And
Mm-hmm.
I also have to preface, when I left the evangelical church,
This was what, 3 months ago or so?
yeah,
Okay.
maybe a little bit longer now. There was not a single bad person at that church, quote unquote bad. There's nobody that there were parents and they were families. They were doing their best, just like we all are trying to. And so when I say I looked at the Bible and I looked at the church and I felt this disparity, I feel like maybe that statement in itself could be misconstrued and it maybe sounds pretentious as if I have knowledge over, someone else. So I'm careful in respecting that different people have different ideas about it. But having said that, when I see the Bible, I feel like there are certain mandates that it gives socially, and I think that would necessarily overlap with some political stuff that we are called to do and that we are called not to do, that we are called to be a part of. And so, yeah.
So you're saying that even though there could be differences of beliefs, I'm just trying to interpret it for myself, even though there could be two different sides or multiple different sides you can come down politically or socially, there are certain things that are clearer than that should transcend political lines or things like that. Is that what you're saying?
I would hope so. Yeah. Transcend, work through, navigate through, that I feel like, both sides, every side could get on board with. And so when, at least in the church that I was a part of, and I say this with a caveat that if I am wrong, I am dead wrong, and I repent of that. I felt at least a kind of culture of silence around the things that were happening nationally. Because if they weren't silent and spoke up, they would look like they were pushing against certain people in power. I'm stepping carefully with what
I
I'm
know,
saying.
and you're stepping around it so carefully, but I'm going to ask for you to maybe not be so careful. Like, what do you mean? Let's not just talk so fluffily. Like, give me an example of where you see some of the, where you personally, again, this is you qualifying that this is your personal view on certain political things, but what was those things for you? Because this is your journey.
Yes. Okay. I think anybody can vote how they want, and I will respect, because that person has a story that led them to that decision. And if I live that story, I might get to that same place politically and socially, however they might think. But I think blind devotion, not asking questions, and not holding accountability of our leaders at the national and local level, that for me was too much.
Mm-hmm.
To see that kind of blind loyalty. And so the silence around that, when something would happen politically or socially, and people just kind of gloss over it and not talk about it. And in the pulpit, I would wonder sometimes, how is the pastor going to extend grace and empathy for the things that are happening? Just to name one, young black men being killed indiscriminately. I know that is a sensitive subject that a lot of people have different feelings about. And I work at a nonprofit charity now where I see people oppressed all the time. And I have taught and trained police officers as a martial artist. And so, being a part of both of those stories, I can see both of those stories colliding. But when I would attend church, sometimes there was nothing. There was kind of a silence around it, a dancing around it, and at worst, sort of passive aggressive. They should know better. This side should know better. We kind of agree that it's this person's fault, not that person's fault. And the conversations became difficult. I felt like I had to hide parts of who I was. And so that was a rough struggle. And that's about as bold as I can say it.
Okay, fair enough.
Unless you wanted me to keep going.
I would appreciate some more of the details behind that, because I think a lot of the people who at least are part of this online community, maybe we don't pay attention to it as much, or maybe I know for me, my tendency as a millennial when I see kind of this crap going on in the internet is to just tune out. Like, I don't want to be a part of that. I just see what happens on both sides, the arguments, and so I literally just turn it off. And so a lot of it for me is I honestly, like, I feel ignorant towards.
Yeah.
I see certain things, I'm just like, whoa, that seems crazy, but I don't ever really go deeper than that.
Yeah, you know what? Justin, at the risk of alienation, I would have to say the last straw for me, which I felt like I just can't stay silent on this. You know what? I'll say two things. One was the child immigrant crisis.
Okay.
The apathy and cruelty of some evangelical churchgoers for me was too much.
Mm.
I couldn't deal with it. Just the outright not understanding, the lack of empathy and compassion towards it, however people might feel about the law or borders. It just some of the comments that I saw and some of the conversations I heard, I couldn't stomach it. And I just thought, I can't keep coming back. I remember turning to my wife after hearing some of the conversations and saying, I don't know if I want to spend another second in this place. I don't feel safe anymore. I just don't feel safe here. And I really think the other one was, we had this Bible study where one of the Bible study teachers spent a good 10 minutes talking about why Colin Kaepernick was not a real Christian. Now, I know there are a lot of different feelings about him, and at the risk of alienating, Colin Kaepernick has a story, like anybody else, that I think deserves exploration and is worth hearing. And to just immediately say, he's not a true Christian, that for me was alarming and sad and sort of infuriating. However people might believe. I don't think that's something that should just outright be said in a Bible study. That's not the Christian spirit.
Interesting. So would you, if you were leading that study, would you have just simply skirted the issue, ignored kind of the context? I mean, because that's more or less my approach. I don't think I've ever made a video talking about these subjects on my channel. I don't have very many conversations about it just because I don't care to get that deep into the murk, perhaps. How would you go about approaching that, or would you say silent?
Yeah, that's a risky subject. So I have several thoughts. I think one, I feel like I need to be more educated on it before I make I want to make an informed opinion about that. So I don't think I've spoken about it as much as I could have. This might be the first time I've even publicly said anything where, I went to a Bible study and they said this, But I would hope that I could handle it with enough balance to where I have an opinion about it, a conviction, and at the same time, I have this closed hand about it, but I have this open hand where I'm holding space for what other people might be thinking and saying about that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's incredibly tough to do. I'm just trying to think of what maybe an objection could be. Like, you're talking about, on one hand, there were two things that stood out to me. It was this kind of bullish way of talking about social issues, and then also you had mentioned earlier the silence that you experienced in the church community with tragedies going on around the world, and yet you just admitted that you were also silent.
Yep.
So how can you criticize the community for that which you're guilty of?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think either in the set of tweets you read, or maybe in another post, I asked the community for forgiveness,
Okay.
because I felt complicit in that grieves my heart. And you said it perfectly. How can I criticize anybody really for their silence when I myself was silent? I don't feel like I speak up enough about Asian American issues, race issues. I tend to stay away from those because part of my heart is that I am a people pleaser. Part of my heart is that I'm insecure to like lose people or alienate them or risk disconnection. But I know that if I'm to speak truth and conviction, people are going to go. You
Yeah.
know, yeah, it's just going to happen. It happened to Jesus. It happened to all the great leaders, and sometimes it happens for not great reasons, and other times it's for the right reasons. So you are absolutely 100% right. I agree with you in that I don't know if I have the right to criticize those who were silent since I was also silent. I think the thing that I can do now is ask for forgiveness. No, I'm not owed that. I'm not entitled to that. And then try to somehow get into the conversation and dialogue and say, here are my mistakes. If maybe somebody else will learn from that or say, hey, I was there too. I was afraid. I was silent. I was part of a community where I felt like I had to hide too, lest I be ostracized or outcasted or even attacked.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I do confess and admit being complicit in that. And I want to do it better. I want to do it better.
I appreciate that. I remember reading one of your posts that talked about kind of the fallout from you publicly leaving church. And it's interesting because you had already said in the tweet that you had left the church for months already
Yep.
prior to the tweet. Then the tweet comes out, and then everyone comes out of the woodwork as though they either, number one, cared for you in that level, and yet you slipped through the crack for months, or they all of a sudden had great or not so great advice. Talk a little bit about what was the response to publicly leaving the church rather than just simply, actually, why not just leave the church silently? Why not just slip out the back door? Why go public? And then talk about the response to your public leaving.
Yeah, I wrestled with that. So again, here are several thoughts. I think, social media is really weird in that there are people who like know you but kind of like don't know you,
Yeah,
and so they kind of
I get it.
they're kind of like in your like on your journey, with you on your journey, and I appreciate that very much. I'm not clowning on that at all.
Hmm.
I've been so lucky to be encouraged online. I've made friends online that I don't know, I haven't met them in real life, but they have been so supportive and encouraging. So there's that where when I did come out publicly, the response was from people who were kind of on the journey with me, but
But not really.
not really. And then, yeah, so that was the kind of the public response, and it was mostly supportive, but a couple, not so much, which is fine. Um, yeah, and I really, really wrestled with, is this something that I should say out loud? And I didn't for 3 months.
Right.
Something worth posting on social media where there's a public platform where a couple people who kind of know me but maybe don't know me would read that. And there were a lot of people who did unfollow. But to more specifically answer your question, the reason why I posted it publicly, I was scared. I don't think I did it for like self-pity or false sympathy, though, our motives are mixed sometimes. Who knows what our motives are, right?
Right. I get that.
Yeah, like we're just all these different kinds of shades, all just kind of different kinds of stuff happening. So it's like, holding all these things together. My hope is that I did it for the right reason, that I was not only expressing where I was at in my story, but if I could give voice to the stories of others that felt like they were waiting for an articulation of thoughts that they had, not that I think I'm some guru or something, but if I could help even one person follow along on that voice or that story, or they feel like, hey, this is my journey too, that for me was worth the risk of alienation, of hate, of trolling, of people unfollowing. All of that I decided was okay with me. And so is there a selfish motive? Maybe. I mean, maybe, But there was another part of me that genuinely, sincerely was like, you know what? I'm going to write this in hopes that this connects with someone.
It connected with me a lot. And I see people in the live chat saying that they remember responding to these tweets as well, and that they were impacted by that as well. I want to know what was an example of some of the perhaps bad advice. You had written about this later on in your journey. And the reason why I want to ask this is because perhaps there are people here who have friends, perhaps children, family members who have left the church. And out of a desire to see them kind of re-enter the fold and kind of rekindle that walk with God, or whatever language you want to use, we try to reach out and be helpful. And maybe we're like Peter, trying to do the Lord good, chopping people's ears off, you know? What was an example of what someone had said, and then what's a lesson that we can learn from that?
Yeah, man, Justin, you are asking awesome questions.
Thank you.
I have to pause and say I'm really loving this and kind of the messy conversations about this. I love it. Yeah, you know, can I just preface by saying when people give advice, whether it's good or bad, I truly want to believe the best about that person, that I think they're giving advice to the best of their knowledge and ability.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So I got to say, because when I say bad advice, it just sounds mean-spirited. I think they have everybody has good hearts, and I've given plenty of bad advice. I include myself in that. The bad advice that I heard, at least just for this situation, was anything that involved turning the blame back on me, or the impetus or responsibility back on me. Like, hey, did you do this? Like, did you even talk with any leaders? Or why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you pray about it? Or, you know, why didn't you try more? Or, you know, those kind of things where there wasn't even an engagement with the things that I was saying. It was more of what I lacked or what I didn't do. And so that for me was kind of like, you know, can you hear my concerns? You know,
why did that sting so much? Because that could be interpreted that you're just really, really, really soft-skinned and it is all about you. Help me understand why that stung so much and why that left such a bad taste.
Yeah, it definitely could be interpreted that way. I think it's because, at least for me, there is a kind of advice that further imprisons or I want to say prevents someone from growth and self-exploration and really getting to a place of healing. And so it is true that there is some advice we need to hear that's hard truth. You know, I think I write about that all the time. We got to tell each other the truth. We have to be open to that one friend who's willing to just, hey, here's what reality is, and here's what the deal is. I'm not against any of that. I love it, in fact. But I think in this case, I was already swimming through what I felt like was grief. And I think people were kind of describing the ways in which I was failing to swim properly or describing the water that I was drowning in. And that for me wasn't helpful or healing or getting me to a place of like even accountability or okay, that truth is actually pretty good. Yeah, and what you're saying is right. I mean, maybe there is kind of like, hey, I should have tougher skin in hearing what they said. But I think anytime someone gives advice that is more of a burden than helping to liberate them or helping them to be free of the hurt they're in, that's when I start to feel like, okay, you can save that for later. Right now, just be with me present in this moment of hurt and help me.
I think that's really, really good. So let's say today, because your journey's not done, but let's say today a 18-year-old so-and-so, a 25-year-old comes up to you and says, Joon, I'm done with the church. I'm so, like, I can't do this anymore. Like, these people, whatever the case is. And they give 7 or 8 good and bad reasons as to why they're done with the church. They're going to college and they're done. How would you respond to this in this situation, learning what you've learned in this journey?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. You know what? I love the church. And I would sit with them in their grief about that. I want to hear all the reasons. I want to know from reason 1 to reason 8.
Sit with them in that grief, because that's a catchphrase. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, you know, not advice it to death. sit with them in validating exactly what they're saying without trying to like do crosstalk or countertalk or trying to disprove the things that they were saying, not moralizing it as if it was their fault.
Okay.
Yeah. So essentially, I wouldn't want to talk to them in a way that immediately moves to lecture, lessons, and action plan. You know, I want to be able to say, yeah, that sucks and that hurt, and do more listen than really advising them. And at the same time, I love the church, and I think community is what it's all about. You know, love God, love people, connecting with God, connecting with people. That is what life is all about. And I pray that I'm saying this for myself too, we would not give up in finding a safe community. I'm not talking about a perfect community. I'm not talking about one where everybody just says all the nice things. But eventually, when they find forgiveness or healing or the thing they need to find through their recovery, that they would find community again. But again, initially, I just want to sit and listen. Just want to hear them out on that.
Yeah, I think that's good. Slow to speak, quick to listen, I think is what the scriptures talk about, right?
Yes, James 1. Yeah, you got it.
Let's talk about that search for community a little bit. You're in this, I don't even know if we can call it a transition because we don't know what happens next. You're in this stage in your journey right now where you're disconnected from the church, disconnected from the body, as it were, in a certain respect. What does your faith journey look like now? What are your hopes? What are you searching for?
A super awesome question. You know, I don't have kids yet, and I can't wait to have them. And maybe this is a generic, easy answer, but this is the thing I have kept thinking about. And you know, to backtrack, I don't know if that's James 1 or not.
It might be.
Somebody can fact check that.
Yeah, I'm sure someone will let us know that you got it wrong.
Yeah, always discern, never trust. No. 1 John 4. I'm constantly thinking right now, is this a place that I feel like I can bring my whole family to, like my kids and everything? And again, that's a generic answer, and I would have to dig deeper on like, what does that mean? What does that look like? What does that look like for my kids? Does it mean they need to have a great daycare? Does it mean they need to have a great youth pastor? But yeah, in one of the tweets, I think I put, I would want to be in a church that sees me both as a child of God and a son to immigrants, or a son of immigrants.
You've used that phrase a handful of times in your writings.
Yeah. And that for me is so important. And you know what? I have difficulty with why is that such a difficulty, it seems, you know?
Help us unpack what that means. What is son of immigrant and a son of God? What does that mean to you?
You know, I think sometimes I feel a discrepancy or sort of an odd feeling of not seeing my heritage and identity as an Asian American, the ethnicity that I hold. And sometimes I hear those things in very subtle ways, like, I'm colorblind, or race doesn't matter, or we're all one race, the human race. And those are very well-intentioned statements. I get that. And at the same time, God has put us in certain cultures, in certain groups and communities for a reason, and are certain places in time. And those things have values that I think overlap with God's values. And so sometimes in communities, particularly evangelical communities, I've seen kind of a homogenization, maybe that's a buzzword,
okay,
of these values that I hold dear in my heritage and in my culture. And so, again, this is a continual process of me trying to figure this out. But I'm trying to understand why that happens, why someone can affirm me as a Christian, but then when it comes to certain parts of like Asian American struggle and feeling like I am invisible, feeling as an Asian American male that I am maybe less attractive or not as visible as some other people, to participate and understand that. And I don't see it all the time, and I wish I would.
This is an odd way to follow that up. Crazy Rich Asians. What was your response to the movie?
Oh man. Um, is this in? Okay, this is gonna sound not appropriate, but so my white friends invited me and my wife to see that. They were
Oh,
so excited for it. And honestly, I was kind of like, I'm not really into romantic comedies. I'm so sorry.
me either.
Good ones. There are really good ones. Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, When Harry Met Sally, Harold and Maude. Those are great. But I was like, oh man. And then I had this weird thing about like, gosh, I don't know. It's weird for me to see. I don't know if it was like a I was discomfort about my own race and seeing myself on the screen. I don't know. There's this weird thing. Am I making sense? I'm probably not making sense. Maybe this is just something you and I, weird level. But I was just like, I don't know. So when they invited me, I was kind of half excited to see it, but I loved it. Not a perfect movie by any means, but I thought it was great. And you know what? This is embarrassing to admit, but about halfway through the movie, it wasn't even a sad scene. I just kind of wept a little bit because I was like, yeah, I was in high school. Where were these Asian Americans on screen?
Right.
And we saw Searching, which stars John Cho. Excellent movie. Absolutely loved it. 100% recommend it.
I haven't watched it. I'll have to check it out.
Oh my gosh, super awesome, good movie. And that one was kind of the Asian identity was almost like taken for granted. Like they didn't get into it so much. It's just like, hey, there's Asians in this movie, So it kind of had that going for it. But yeah, that's funny that you even asked that. I love it that we are becoming more visible.
Yeah. It was nice. I can kind of understand what you're saying as far as the homogenization, this like, oh no, we're all just one. There is no uniqueness. And while that's, I think in a certain degree, like well-intentioned and true, there also is the other side of the coin, the other part of the reality that is, no, we are also the product of where we've been and the product of our history and our story. Like that, those things still do matter.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We're going to turn to the live chat in just a second. We have a handful of people hanging out with us right now. I want to know if there's any questions that you would like to ask Joon here as we're hanging out over the last couple of minutes. As you guys are writing in questions, it could be about something that I've already talked about, a question I haven't even thought of yet, follow up to something that he said. Let us know in the chat real quick. As they're typing that in, perhaps my last thought of question at least is, what are your hopes for the church now, moving forward? If you had the opportunity to kind of help shift the culture in a certain respect, what would that look like? What do you hope the church is to become in the years to come?
Yeah, you know what? I think the most obvious answer, and I feel like anybody could answer this, is that I do hope the church becomes known as being the most loving place in the universe. That's my, and on the other hand, I also hope that the church is called to be its own most accountable critic. And I say that with gentleness and respect. But before people even get to say, hey, why are you doing this? I would hope that the church would look at themselves first, and we're already known for examining ourselves. With the things that are, I'm being sensitive when I say this, but with the things happening in the Catholic Church, and things happening in the evangelical community and kind of the blindness to real racial, social, and political issues and sort of the passive-aggressive tone around that, with some of the lack of generosity that I've seen in our churches. Just as a side note, I work as a chaplain also, not just at the hospital, but at this nonprofit homeless charity. And trying to partner with local churches is super difficult. There have been great ones, and there have been ones who, yeah, we're committed and we love what you're doing, never hear from them again.
Wow.
And that's a little maybe dark, dirty secret that I shouldn't say out loud. But
I think it's true. It's been true in my experience. I mean, you're always looked at as an enemy the moment you try and bring up opportunities for growth in a church context. That you could hear people saying, oh, this is the Lord's anointed, don't you know you shouldn't, like, but that's not applicable here. Like, we're just simply talking about how can we do things better as a body? How can we improve and be the church that God has called us to be? So I've seen that
Yeah.
in church communities before, for sure.
Yeah, if I could put this in a tweet, Justin,
Sure.
here's how I would put it. My hope for the church is that we would be more accepting and more self-aware at the same time.
Mm.
Yeah, that there is just a love pouring out, and also an examination of our own values and identity, who we are, what we're doing.
Love it. Awesome. Very good. We got a couple questions from the live chat right now. Natalie writes in first saying, June, I came on late, so I might have missed this, but are you currently looking for a home church or a community?
Yes, my wife and I are definitely, and my dog.
Is that a selling point? You can bring your dog into the community?
They gotta love my dog.
We just got a puppy in the recent months, and we actually didn't get to go to church for a couple of weeks because of the puppy thing. It's like, well, we can't really just leave this brand new dog at home, can we? We could have, I think, but we just didn't.
Sometimes I've made the mistake of comparing owning a dog with raising a baby. Don't ever do that. I've learned. Never. Whoops. I was like, oh yeah, I know what parenting is like because I have a difficult dog. And it's like, parents will all turn their heads and just look at you mid and just be like, are you what? Why would you? Yeah. But yes, currently searching for a church. Definitely.
Awesome. Very good. Andrew is asking, Andrew42 says, will you start a home church?
Oh my gosh.
Which, by the way, we talked about this off camera. This book, again, by Francis Chan, Letters to the Church, I would highly recommend you read this. He's talking a lot about the values of home churches and kind of the limitations and the challenges and the problems with kind of the more mega church model, the consumeristic kind of approach to church. And he says that church B&B, like an Airbnb model, is his best answer so far.
Yeah, you know what? Here's my answer right now, and if God calls me otherwise, I would do differently, and this is going to be kind of a selfish answer.
Mm-hmm.
I think right now I'm not sure I feel called to a home church, and only because, like my work is, I'm very lucky that my work overlaps with ministry work.
Yeah.
The job that I get paid to do is also my calling, and maybe I shouldn't, separate those things, but my work is my ministry, and so when I come home,
you want to kind of sign off of that.
Sort of my refuge and rest away from the world.
I get that.
So for now, I don't know if I can blend all that together.
Yeah.
And again, that sounds super selfish, and if God calls me to change that, I will answer that call.
Yeah. No, I get that.
That is where I'm at right now.
I'm in the process of getting tied into a local church here in the Northwest. And the thing that drew me to this specific church was that when I sat down and had like coffee with this pastor, like he had already assumed that I was plugged into a church somewhere else. And when I had like kind of let on the fact that I didn't have a church and I wasn't sure about church, he's like, dude, like, I'm so sorry. Like, you could totally come. And like, he said something to me recently this last week. He's like, dude, if the church still needs to be a place where you can be invisible, like, we can totally do that. And for me, it was because so much of my life is ministry. And then I come to the church and I'm viewed as an asset before I am viewed as a person for what I can contribute rather than just being part of the body. So for me, that has been something that has been really hard, is like literally every other church that I visited, they kind of get wind of my YouTube channel or my ministry prior to my YouTube channel, because I'd have a decade of ministry prior to that. And it's just like, oh, sweet, you can preach and you can teach this and you can take control of this. It's like, no, like I need a place where I can be rejuvenated as well.
Yeah, dude, if you learn the secret of invisibility, like you get that one ring or the Harry Potter's cloak, let me know how that goes.
Yeah, for sure. There's another really great question I wanted to throw out. Caleb is asking, how can young people lead our churches in a different direction while still being respectful of our leaders?
That is a super, man, I love these questions.
We've got a great community here online. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I love it. How can we be, yeah. Change takes time, and it's painful for a lot of people. And so I think a lot of these matters do need to be brought up with care and gentleness and checking our own motives as much as possible. Like, am I saying this out of anger? Am I saying this because I think my vision is the best? You know, and so I think for Caleb, if he's wanting to do that, for him, I do recommend that he be in conversation with his leaders as much as possible in a gentle, caring manner. I think what usually ends up happening, and I can attest to this, is that people, out of maybe fear or complacency or not wanting to get into that messiness, won't bring those things up and will leave, figures out otherwise, and things keep going the way they are. The person who left stays dissatisfied.
Yeah.
And I can attest to that, because I think when I left the church I just left, I do admit, I think I could have had more conversations with more people. I did have them, I think, with the people that to me were safe enough to tell and where it mattered and where maybe change could have happened, but I wish I would have done more of that. And so for Caleb to have the bravery and courage and the grace to be able to bring that up.
Awesome. I think that's a great response. And I personally know Caleb, and I know that that's definitely the approach that he takes. I talk to Caleb probably on at least every other day basis, and he and I are on the same page as far as trying to take that posture of humility and grace and patience, and just to try and be that change. So I think that was great response. I love that. You got time for a few more questions? We got some doozies.
Yeah.
Okay. Ray Johnson, I think this is more of just a respond to this idea, and I'm really curious as well. He says, since leaving the church, I've actually been closer to God. I once thought I was going to burn in hell for it. Now I just feel better.
Wow. I'm so curious about what kind of church he was at, what his experiences were like, just both atmospherically and relationally.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, he must have been in a hard, hurtful place. I would love to hear that story. And holding that space, and then also holding the space of community is so important, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's so super important. We can't be without community, and I pray when he is ready, that he finds that.
Yeah, definitely. I had this conversation with a different friend 2 weeks ago about my journey kind of on the outskirts of church and trying to figure this all out. And his comment to me was a quotation from C.S. Lewis that God stoops to save. The concept that God would lower himself so much that he would even be willing to lead a young person away from the church, his body, to reach them.
Yeah, I love that. And I love C.S. Lewis. He is my first love.
CJ Lingle's asking, how can we as a church be better at accepting others without condoning their lifestyle, especially in regards to the LGBT community?
Man, you know what, I am struggling with the premise of that question in itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
How so?
Gosh, okay. Can you read the question one more time?
How can we as a church be better at accepting others without having to condone their lifestyle, especially as it regards towards the LGBT?
Yeah. So maybe this is not the intention of the person asking this question, but I'm trying to move away from language like lifestyle, condone. I think those assume a posture of superiority, as if my choices, my thing is better than the other person's thing. And it's like, I want to stay on this equal playing field of we're all trying to figure it out. Mm-hmm. We're all struggle bus kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so for the person asking that question, I would question that question. And then I would want to receive and hear people as all of them as sinners in need of salvation, as broken people in need of healing, and not try to say, hey, how can I receive this person, but also at the same time not condone it? That to me just seems, there's a lot of presumption in that question. So maybe I'm having trouble articulating and I'm not saying it really well, but I just struggle. I'm an interfaith chaplain. I work with so many different religions, so many different orientations, so many different kinds of people and all different conditions. And I just try to come into the room as a weary traveler. I don't know if that's a cop-out answer that I'm giving right now.
I don't know. I
Or,
think let me see if I'm picking up what you're trying to say. You want to move less in the direction of an us versus them, that there's a distinction between myself and that person, no matter what that person identifies as or defines themselves as, because we are all under the same category that are sinners in need of Christ. And
yeah.
my particular brand of sin might be different than your brand of sin, but it's all the same. We all still need Jesus. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think so. Maybe more or less. Yeah, maybe give or take there. I think maybe just a 10-second example would be, we learn in the healthcare field when I was at the hospital doing all the training that we don't want to be necessarily in a provider-patient model,
Okay.
but that rather we're all peers.
Uh-huh.
And so we're entering kind of on this equal playing field. It's just that person happened to get sick and that person happened to not have the privilege of education and those, or they don't have they're not privy to what the doctor has and the nurse has. So to be in that kind of provider patient, the more you get into that, it starts to enter into kind of a hero savior type of syndrome.
Yeah. We in America are terrible at that.
So I'm so careful around the language used. And again, that person who asked that question, I am not trying to be hard on them or to assume their motives, but I would just question that question. And
CJ is a good guy. I'm sure he's not feeling that way at all.
Yeah.
We got a handful of other questions. I'll limit it to one other. So do me a favor. Let us know where we can connect with you. Social. What are some of the things that you got going on? Projects, opportunities for us to engage with you, and then we'll ask our last question before we close out.
Okay. Oh, so is this the shameless plug part?
This is the shameless plug part.
Hey. All right. Well, I am currently working on a book called The Voices We Carry.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that will be released maybe within the year or so. Books take like forever to get published. But yeah, it's about all the voices that we have. I got a lot of my chaplain education in that book, but voices like self-doubt, people-pleasing, ego, blind spots, and I especially take on trauma, grief, and family dynamics. Mm. So each chapter is a different voice that we deal with both internally and from external sources, and how those voices have shaped us and even how they can help us. So I'm really excited about that. If you see me on Instagram, I do typewriter therapy. It's my favorite thing in the world.
You do a great job at it too.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, that's at JS Park 3000, and you can find me also on Facebook, Twitter, all the social media stuff.
Cool. We'll be sure to include those links in the description below this video, of course. To kind of close us off, and before I do that, Joon, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your journey, sharing your story, wearing your heart on a sleeve, and just kind of, doing life in the way that you can do it best and follow God in the way that you see it best. I really appreciate your transparency and your honesty and the graciousness in which you handle all these conversations.
Yeah, no, thank you. And the questions were great. Some of them were surgical.
Awesome. Appreciate that. All right. Last question before we close out. And this one I think was an important one to conclude on because there's a lot of people who are in this camp. The question is, what should a parent say to kids that come out and say, why are you forcing me into this religion? Mind you, there isn't much youth in the church. A lot of church members see this trend of young people leaving and they want to do something. And especially for parents, that's going to be much more difficult. What would you say to that? Yeah,
I'm speaking from a perspective of not being a parent. So I preface it by saying, definitely not a parent. Is this person asking as a parent?
Yes, this person is a parent, yeah.
Okay, this person is a parent. So what I am saying might sound pretentious and like maybe I'm saying more than I actually know. But I can speak from the perspective of what my parents wanted for me. I think my parents wanted me to marry a certain race, have a certain profession, be a certain religion.
How many of those boxes have you ticked so far?
Oh my gosh. Maybe more than I care to admit.
Your wife is Korean, right?
Yes, she is.
Okay, so you got at least that one. That's a big one.
Yeah. No. Uh, so I think there's when talk with parents and meet with them and counsel them, there is such a struggle between how much as a parent can I guide and raise them up in the right way,
Mm.
and at the same time allow them to make their own choices and mistakes. And that has been like the lifelong, age-old struggle, right?
Yeah.
But I think, at least for me, speaking as a child of parents who were pretty strict and tried to get me to do certain things, if it wasn't my choice, I would have felt imprisoned or somehow lesser, or like I was living a second-rate life and somebody else had picked out my vision for me. And so I had to fight against that so hard. And some might say, oh, you're being rebellious, or some might say you got to honor your parents, but I had to fight against that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, parents have a super hard job, and I'm going to find out.
Yeah. I'm so ignorant to this as well. I'm the child, and I've always been the stubborn, rebellious kind. You tell me no, it means yes. You tell me yes, it means no. And I resonate with what you're saying as far as allowing them to make that choice, but that's so scary because they could choose something different. But I resonate with what you said. If it was a choice that was forced on me, it's such a shallow decision. And I think that's what we're kind of perhaps seeing with so many young people who are technically raised in the church, in the sense that they attend church every weekend, or whatever the case is. But the moment they have a hint of freedom, like, they're gone. Perhaps it might be, and I guess I'm also speaking very ignorantly from this perspective, but perhaps it might be like, holding onto a bar of soap in the shower. The harder you grab onto it, the more likely it is to get away from you. So obviously bathing that in prayer, but then, trying to lead as you lead in a dance. The dance leader isn't someone who forces and shoves the partner around, but gently and gracefully is leading. So hopefully that's helpful. We got a lot of good questions. I want to thank all of you guys who are here live. Do me a favor, if you haven't done it yet, give this video a thumbs up. Go ahead and share it with a friend. And let me know something really that will help me out. This is the first time we have done a live stream interview like this. It's long form. It's a podcast style. Usually I would take this entire conversation and edit it down to maybe 15 minutes. I want to know if you guys think we should be doing more of this, if we can have maybe Joon back on the channel when his book is ready to go out, if we should be investigating other speakers, other people that you'd like to hear about. Let me know in the comments below if this is something you'd like to see more of. We're going to close off for now. And so until next time, I'm that Christian vlogger. I want to encourage you to experience faith in the first person. God bless.